See how many people are. First, he has to hook it up to YouTube. Stay connected.
We are live.
Thank you. So good evening, everyone. I do see the numbers of attendees continuing to increase. So I want to give them a few minutes to get settled in as part of the webinar this evening. So good evening, everyone. We'll give it a few more minutes as attendees continue to log in. Now it appears as if we're starting to slow down with attendees coming in. So we'll give it another 30 seconds or so. So good evening, everyone. We're giving this just a few seconds to let attendees log in. Okay. Okay, so it's 6:35 and I think we'll get started. So I want to welcome everyone to this evening's community forum on reopening schools. And it's been a couple of weeks since I've had a conversation with you in this format, and we're not using Facebook live stream this evening. We're instead communicating with you via a Zoom webinar and also live streaming on YouTube. So the technology is a little bit different this evening. I do want to introduce some other administrators that are here this evening assisting with the conversations tonight. We do have Mr. Ganesh, who is our Chief Information Officer overseeing the technology. And we have Mrs. Lester, who is our Manager of Communication and School District Partnerships. And we have Dr. Kim Boyd, who is our Director of Special Ed. And we have Mrs. Laurie Smith, who is our Assistant to the Superintendent for Curriculum and Instruction. So as we get into some conversations tonight about instruction for the fall, which I'm predicting is really what you're interested in learning most about tonight, or hearing about where we are with our thinking, the two of them, Dr. Boyd and Mrs. Smith, will be able to help out and share in the conversation. So I'll progress through some slides, and they'll really serve as speaking points for me and also as a reference for you. These will be posted on our website following tonight's conversation. You do have an opportunity to submit comments tonight or share in the conversation. And again, I have an assistant here with me who will be fielding the questions as you submit them. If you go into the chat feature, you'll see that there is a link to a Google Doc. Oh, it's actually a Google form, excuse me, where you can submit your questions. And throughout the presentation, I'm happy to entertain your questions and review anything that maybe isn't already scheduled to be discussed. Don't hesitate. So these individuals that are here with me tonight will sort of flag me and help me to know if there are some questions that would make sense to answer through the presentation, or we'll just wait to the end and address them, as really what I've done in the past. But we want to make sure that we engage you in the conversation. So really what I want to talk to you is about is developing a reopening schools plan. And I'll start with the work that's been done to date. And I am aware that we've talked about some of this work in some different settings. So you may have heard some of this. Maybe this is new information to you, but I do want to just very briefly bring you up to date on some of the work that's been conducted up to this point by the school district as we think about how we're going to reopen schools. There has been a task force developed, and that task force consists of teachers, administrators, parents, board members, and we have a student. Our student board rep is on that committee. And we've been engaging in conversations that are primarily guided by a template plan that's expected by the state, by the Pennsylvania Department of Education, to have approved by our Board of School Directors and the Department of Education before we can bring students back into our school setting. So the task force has met 4 times over the course of end of June through July and discussed some of the considerations we need to make as we think about bringing students back into our schools. So the plan for PDE, the Pennsylvania Department of Ed, is focused primarily on health and safety of our students and staff in school buildings during this pandemic. So we got that to a place where we presented a draft to our board last night, and they've opted to wait a little bit longer and have some more discussions before approving it. And we have some time before they have to do that. Our goal is to really have all planning finalized by the end of July so that we can share those final plans with our community, and you can make plans on a personal level for the school year. In addition to the task force participating in these conversations, we've talked about aspects of reopening our schools in some of our committee settings: wellness committee, finance committee, policy committee. In each of those committee conversations, there are points that connect to what we need to think about as we prepare to reopen schools. We did administer a survey to our parents earlier on in July. We're going to update that, and I'll talk about that a little bit with you this evening. And the purpose of sending you an updated survey, we're also planning to send a survey to our staff. We really want to zero in on where people are in their thinking based upon where the district is in its thinking right now. And certainly we've had lots of conversations about reopening schools at board meetings in board settings. I have a couple of presentations that I have followed as part of the superintendent's report, both on the July 6th, which continued on to July 8th board meeting. If you were a part of that, that meeting was paused last Monday, July 6th, continued on July 8th. And then last night at the business meeting, I also shared again some additional information about reopening schools. And again, what we're thinking about as we prepare to start up the 2021 school year. So the draft plan that was reviewed last night by our board and has been developed by the task force looks like this. This is the title page that you see on the slide right now. It's called a phased school reopening health and safety plan. And it really focuses on how are you going to clean your buildings? How are you going to ventilate the air in your buildings? How are you going to disinfect your buildings? How are you going to maintain social distance? Keep students that 6 feet apart that's recommended right now in Montgomery County, wearing masks. How will you bring them together for lunch or feed them lunch? Engage in classroom instruction. So the safety aspects of having a large number of students in our buildings is what's covered in this plan. It's what's discussed. We've also had some very helpful input by Mrs. Meg Lewis and the nurses in our school district. They've been collaborating with the County Department of Health, the Office of Public Health, and the State Department of Health, and come up with ways that we can monitor students and staff and their health on a regular basis, and ways that we can know to be aware, to self-monitor before we would come onto school property or come into a school building. So the thing about this plan, because when we hear the word plan, I think a lot of us are really hopeful, and we're figuring out how are we actually going to do school in the fall with this plan. This plan doesn't really talk about the details of how we instruct our students in the fall. So I want to talk to you a little bit more about that tonight and where we are in our thinking. So the state's plan, the one that we've been working on, is really focused on the health and safety, those guidelines we need to uphold to do the best we can at mitigating the spread of the virus. So this is the big question. How are we going to instruct our students in the fall? And right now, we're talking about 3 different instructional models. We've considered a traditional model, where really that's the normal we know. That's school as we know it and how we left it in March, before the schools were mandated to be closed by our governor due to the pandemic. We've also talked about a hybrid, and maybe you've heard this term thrown around a little bit or used in different conversations. I want to define that a little bit better for you tonight. When we use the term hybrid, a hybrid instructional model really means it's a combination of some of that traditional, students on site in their buildings and classrooms, and it's also some virtual, where they learn remotely, maybe at home or at the home of a family member somewhere off-site. And then the third instructional model that we're looking at is purely virtual, where students learn via a purely virtual model. They are remote, anywhere, anytime learning. They do not come on site into any of our school buildings. So I want to talk just a little bit about some of the data we've also been discussing as part of our conversations before I come back to those different instructional models and where we're leaning right now and why. So a couple of weeks ago, the American Academy of Pediatrics came out with a press release, and they made a statement that we really think it's important that kids get back to school in the fall. And I don't know that there's any of us that would disagree with that statement. We recognize that certainly it's where the bulk of our students' learning occurs. Lots of socialization, emotional and behavioral development occurs for our students. It's a safe place for a lot of our students. They get meals, and they really build those relationships that can be long lasting and support them in terms of their confidence, their self-esteem, and really their maturation, the way that they develop. So when they're out of school, they're missing out on all of those things. So essentially, the American Academy of Pediatrics said, we need to get kids back in school. They're missing out on all of these things, these aspects that really support their growth and their development. Last week, they came back with a revised statement that certainly continues to support we need to get kids back in school. That's ideal. The school that we know, the learning environments, the social environments that we know. However, we do need to make sure that it's safe and feasible to bring students back into the school setting in the ways that we know. So the American Academy of Pediatrics did revise their statement a little bit and incorporated those serious considerations for us to make as school communities before bringing students back into the buildings. We also know that from our governor, there was recently an order that indicates when we bring our kids back into the buildings, they must wear a face covering. We've learned that through research connected to the spread of this virus, masks or face coverings are a strong protector against the spread of the virus. So if and when we bring our students back into our buildings, they will be expected to wear masks, as will our staff. And we also have some face shields. The idea would be then that because this virus is transmitted via air, we would prevent that to a great degree or a greater degree versus not wearing the masks. And then of course, if you look further down on this slide, we talk about eating and drinking when students are in school. Lots of them have breakfast. They all have lunch. They certainly can't eat with a mask on. So another requirement, another guideline that we're expected to uphold in addition to the masks is to keep students 6 feet apart, to socially distance them 6 feet when they're not wearing a mask. So for example, in a cafeteria where they would be eating, or in a classroom where they might be eating, they need to be 6 feet apart. And Montgomery County is really standing firm on that 6 feet as a social distance between individuals, whereas you may be familiar with data from other health agencies, county health agencies, that will suggest 3 to 6 feet. Montgomery County feels pretty strongly it's got to be 6 feet without a mask. So that doesn't give us a lot of flexibility to manage and organize classrooms or cafeteria spaces in the ways that we're used to. It really limits us. So we're focused on social distancing in addition to those masks. Those will be new and different approaches once inside our buildings as we operate under the circumstances and conditions of the pandemic. This is an example of an elementary classroom where the desks are spread apart 6 feet. We cannot get a full class of students in a classroom where the desks are spread apart 6 feet. In this particular classroom, there's about 15 or 16 desks. We can probably squeeze in 16. However, most of our classes are more like 18 to 24 or so at the elementary level in this particular class. So 2 areas of focus for us as we think about bringing our students back: masks, face coverings, and social distancing. So what are some of the data telling us? What's happening with coronavirus and what's happening with the spread of this virus in Pennsylvania? And we'll drill down to Montgomery County. And you can see that in the last few days, there has been an increase in the number of cases. This came from the New York Times and it was published on July 12th. And if you happen to look into this article, they have every state in the United States described and represented this way. This zeroes in on Pennsylvania in a little bit with a different visual. So this is Montgomery County here. You can see the number of cases as represented by the size of the circle relative to other areas of the state. So Philadelphia has a much higher number of cases than Montgomery County. And it's actually southern Montgomery County that's most affected or more severely affected, although Upper Providence has a high number of cases, more so than it is the northern end of Montgomery County. These are data from the county's Office of Public Health, Montgomery County website, indicating total positive cases to date. And then this is really our area. So we'll drill down. These are the cases that are within the Perkiomen Valley School District and the 6 municipalities that we serve. And again, if you're interested in these data and looking more at these data, it's on the Montgomery County website. So there was an article published and the Secretary of the Department of Health, State Department of Health, Dr. Rachel Levine, was quoted as and really informed readers about the increased number of cases now being realized in individuals ages 19 to 49, and where Pennsylvania's aged 65 and older once constituted the bulk of the cases. So older individuals that early on in this pandemic, we learned seemed to be more susceptible. And if they had pre-existing conditions or were immunocompromised, that made them more susceptible. However, we've seen a shift in individuals that are afflicted by the virus. And now the percentage has pretty much evened out based upon this statement published yesterday. It's evened out where Pennsylvanians aged 65 and older are now pretty close to matching the number of individuals between 19 and 49 that are also testing positive for COVID-19. So that age group now comprises about 45% of our total state caseload. So as we think about instruction and going back to those 3 instructional models that I just went over, we have real questions about the traditional model. If we think about that traditional model and bringing all students back in each of our 7 buildings, and I always go to the high school because there are 1,800 students scheduled to be enrolled in the high school this fall. 1,800 students in that setting is an awful lot of students. And to be able to maintain social distancing in the ways that we typically operate our schools is going to be extremely challenging. So that traditional approach right now is not one that I'm recommending because I don't know that it's feasible and allows us to uphold the health and safety guidelines that we're obligated to uphold to make sure our students and staff remain safe to the best of our ability. So what I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about includes the hybrid model. I want to talk to you a little bit more about what that means and answer your questions about that. And I want to talk to you a little bit more about virtual options that the school district currently offers and will be expanding and strengthening. I've heard from some parents that they have a real interest in a virtual option for their child. There is a level of nervousness on the part of some people for returning their children to these congregate settings, these somewhat crowded school settings. And in response to that anxiety, if you will, or those real serious questions about putting children back into those settings, has come the questions about a virtual option where students could, again, learn anywhere, anytime. They can learn from home. They can learn remotely. They do not need to come into our school buildings when they participate virtually. So let's talk a little bit more about those. Just a little bit more data that supports, again, my stating that traditional model is really not realistic right now, and it's not feasible, in my view, to keep all individuals in our school community safe. And this is a study that was prepared by the Institute of Education Sciences. There's a reference here if you're interested in looking at it, and it talks about how one of the most effective ways to mitigate the spread of the virus is to reduce the number of people in any one setting. So it aligns with the social distancing. So the largest reductions in the infections come from dividing students into smaller groups, which is what we would do in a hybrid approach. And this slide just gives you a little bit more detail about that. So when we talk about a hybrid approach, that middle model on our graphic, we would really reduce the number of students by at least half in any building at any one time. So we would bring in half of the students 2 days a week, maybe 3 days a week, alternating with them working at home virtually or remotely. So that hybrid divides the students in half and also splits their learning experiences between on-site in the school buildings and virtual, remote. So there's flexibility for families and in particular students. And we would certainly want to work to keep families, students of the same family, on the same schedules if there are several students or children in an elementary school. As we think about the way to make the hybrid, ways to make the hybrid model work, we are thinking about things that help lend themselves to efficiency for families. So keeping students on the same schedule, as I mentioned, this is really a combination of in-school learning and remote learning. And certainly we would be supporting our teachers in this model with collaboration and professional development opportunities. So again, these are some of the salient points connected to that hybrid instructional model. So I know that during the spring, when we were sort of thrust into virtual learning, where everybody was learning remotely, we had some questions about that experience for our students and the lack of structure to it, the lack of schedule to it. So for the virtual portion of a hybrid model, we would certainly offer more structure and more synchronous learning opportunities. So when I say synchronous learning, that means there's a scheduled time to meet with a teacher in a Zoom or a Google Hangout or a Google Meet, some sort of digital meeting with a teacher. It's scheduled, just like a class is scheduled. So in any kind of virtual learning in the fall, whether it's a part of the hybrid or it's that purely virtual model that we offer, there would be much more synchronous learning and scheduling of the learning in those experiences. So please know that, and I recognize that was a real concern as we worked on this the last time. So again, we're going to alternate groups of students being on site versus being at home working remotely in a virtual setting. That's that hybrid model. So on any given day when we have students on site, we really only have half the number of students in the building. That's the advantage of the hybrid, if you will. Decreasing those numbers, offsetting the spread of the virus. And then there is that virtual learning model that we talked about. And this is gaining in popularity based upon some of the data that we're observing and some of the occurrences across the country as other states have opened up and engaged students in particular in some camp settings or adults in communities. We're seeing the number of cases in those areas increase pretty dramatically. And again, I think that's raising some questions for people, and it's disrupting their comfort level with sending students back to school. So in response, we have a virtual learning model, and we can support individuals, any number of students in any grade, working virtually. So if you are somebody that's really interested in a virtual option, you can subscribe to that. Right now, we have a PV virtual school. So if you go to our webpage and you look at our homepage and the schools tab, you'll see each of our school buildings listed. You'll also see PV Virtual as a school that's listed. That's represented in the middle here. We don't have a large number of students that participate in our current PV Virtual school, but we have some. And the curriculum is delivered by through the MCIU, our intermediate unit, and another vendor that really prepares that curriculum and provides the teacher of record to engage the students. And it's primarily asynchronous. So students are working on really quite a bit, to a great extent, on an independent level. We do have a Perkiomen Valley High School teacher in there to provide some oversight, some guidance, some advice, but students are following a curriculum that's been board approved and working primarily independently or in an asynchronous manner. This is a PVSD school, so students graduate from our high school having moved through the PV virtual, that virtual learning program, if you will. Now, to the left, when you see this fall virtual voyage, we want to expand virtual offerings, and we want our teachers to deliver the virtual learning experiences. And again, they'll be synchronous in nature, so they'll be scheduled. If your child had math at 8 o'clock last year and then social studies at 9 o'clock, we plan to schedule something very similar in a virtual learning environment on a virtual learning platform. So over here, there will be lots more synchronous learning, scheduled learning, more rigorous in nature, challenging for our students in this expanded virtual model that involves our teachers. So those of you that are really interested in virtual school for your children, we have that option available to you, and it will involve Perkiomen Valley School District teachers, any level. We'll also provide you a device so that you have a computer or a Chromebook to use while participating in this way. And I know that I became aware of some questions. There are lots of cyber charter schools that also offer virtual learning, and they're advertising out there, and maybe you're aware of some of them. Those cyber schools offer a fully virtual experience. They are not Perkiomen Valley School District experiences, though. That's a separate public school, really, technically, under the law. So a cyber charter school or a cyber school is not overseen by Perkiomen Valley, nor would it involve any of our teachers. That's a separate school system. So PA Leadership, PA Virtual Academy, Agora Cyber School. These are charter schools that offer virtual learning also, not PVSD. They are not Perkiomen Valley schools. So we would advocate, if you're really interested in that virtual experience for your children, we would advocate for the fall virtual voyage. And certainly are open to answering more questions. Mrs. Smith is here, Dr. Boyd is here in the event you have some. So I sort of talked about this a little bit. What would virtual remote learning look like? Again, I want to call out and really emphasize there would be increased face time with teachers and more of a synchronous schedule. One of the other aspects of the school experience in the spring that we recognized was the lack of social and emotional interaction for our kids. And we are hearing more and more that there may actually be voids or gaps. And we're thinking about how we reconnect and reacclimate our students to school and to one another. And that FaceTime with teachers and some of the students in their classes will help to do that. And we really want to take time out in any class to connect with our students and to have some of that conversation that maybe has been lacking over the past several months if they've really been limited in their social experiences, which is what we believe is happening for many. So as I mentioned, there would be much more structure and rigor to the virtual experience, that fall virtual voyage, we're calling it, in the fall versus this past spring. This past spring, there was a lot of asynchronous learning experiences and students were working independently to a great extent. We would have more formalized and traditional grading practices, attendance practices, and certainly support collaboration and professional development for our staff. Teaching in a virtual environment is really different in many respects to teaching in a classroom setting, that traditional setting. So we've been working to support our teachers and assist them in being ready for this virtual experience. Because regardless of how we end up starting the school year, and honestly, I don't see it being a traditional mode where we have all students back in all of our buildings. Right now, I see it being either a hybrid or really a virtual model. Regardless of how we start, we know we might have to shift pretty quickly. So we're working to be prepared for any of those instructional models that may become a reality in the upcoming school year. So I've sort of talked about this. This is a visual for you. This is an example of an elementary student schedule and how they might move through the day. Again, much more structured and routine for our students, similar to the routines they follow when they're in the building, and then the same for high school. So again, it would follow more of that traditional schedule for our students so that they would be committed to attending a class or logging into a class if they're participating in this virtual voyage. They're committed to logging in and participating just as they would have in that traditional setting. There have been a couple of questions about NorthMontco, so I wanted to make sure that I reference this. Now, NorthMontco is challenged in how they plan to engage students with instruction in the fall because they support 5 schools. So NorthMontco Technical Career Center hosts students from North Penn, Souderton, Wissahickon, Methacton, and Perkiomen Valley. And their hope is to bring all students back in ways that align to the school district's plan. So if we bring our students back in some sort of hybrid model, some days on site and some days in a virtual setting, they'll align with us and do the same. And we want to continue to support our Technical Career Center students by transporting them and making sure that if there is learning happening and they can access it, that we help to get them there in the fall. So we have to see how those plans finalize. The tech school is in a tough spot because the director is waiting to hear from the other 5 schools before making a final decision. So know that we're in conversations with the director from NorthMontco, and she's working diligently to make sure that she accommodates students from each of those 5 schools in ways that align to each of those 5 schools. And she also mentioned that they're going to be working on some virtual lessons similar to some of the work that we did in the spring, and I'm sure we'll do again in the fall under any kind of virtual circumstances, so that if students are unable to attend school, there will be ways for them to access the learning. So last night, if you were listening into the board meeting, participating, you may be aware that there was support offered by our teachers group for the virtual model, believing that at this point in time, based upon all that we know, it is believed to be the safest. And that model is the safest not only for our students, but for our teachers. And when we think about bringing students back into the school settings, not only do I think about their safety, the safety of our staff, but I also think about the community and its safety as those students eventually leave our buildings and our teachers leave the buildings and they go out into that community. So we need to really be cognizant of how this virus spreads, and the more people we bring together, how that affects our chances of spreading the virus. So some of the thoughts that we have as we consider what might be for the fall and what might make the most sense. So really focused on that hybrid model right now, or that virtual model, as feasible approaches, healthy, safe approaches to bringing our kids back to school in the fall. I want to let you know, and I'm going to go back to the slide that goes over the instructional models as I take some questions, but I also wanted to just point out there will be another parent survey that comes out this week, and it's going to be very intentional to you and your child or your children. So it will actually indicate your child's name and ask of you what your intentions are for the fall. I'm really interested in knowing your comfort level with bringing your student back into a school building, or maybe you're more comfortable with a virtual approach at this point in time. I'm hoping to learn that from you, as well as whether or not you will be comfortable putting your child on a bus, or instead will prefer to drive your child to school in the event we're back in the building. So busing is also a real challenge. I've talked about this in some different situations. Our buses can be crowded. We're gonna work to decrease the numbers on our buses. Students would be expected to wear masks, sit no more than 2 to a seat, and maybe stay with siblings when it's possible. However, busing will be a challenge. And I know that in the first survey we administered, lots of you offered to be available to drive your children to school, almost 50%, maybe even a little more, which is a really big help. And I think in the interest of our students as well, if it can work for you as a family. So we'll be administering another parent survey this week. We want to know from you now, with more information. Hopefully you feel better informed about things. What is your intention for the fall? And it's a little bit of a chicken egg. We need to know where you are in your thinking as we continue to shape our plan and finalize our plans. Our task force will meet this week and next week, really as an admin team to focus on some of the things we need to do in school. I'm also meeting with teacher leadership on a weekly basis. And then on the 29th, we'll bring back our diverse task force group, that group that I first mentioned, that consists of parents, board members, students, teachers, administrators. We'll come back together again and attempt to finalize our plans before presenting to our board and really communicating out to the community. We want a decision by the end of July so that you have time to prepare. I haven't mentioned PIAA sports, fall sports. If you have a child that participates in high school PIAA athletics, you know that voluntary practices were approved through the athletics plan last week by our board. And there are some optional open voluntary practices that are happening. Again, we need to practice social distancing, and when students are not actively engaging in exercise and exerting themselves, they need to be wearing masks. So if they're standing on the sideline, if they're just listening to someone speak, a coach, they should be wearing a mask. So again, focused on that social distance as well as the mask. So PIAA is also talking about what they're going to do for the fall. We have not heard of a final decision yet, but I am aware there are conversations happening. And one other way I'd like to engage the community, and I just want to put this out here tonight because I have a captive audience, is I'd really like to form some focus groups and engage you in communicating about some of the aspects of our school as we redesign it and we reimagine it for the fall. And where do you have expertise or specialties that you could or be willing to share with the school district and really partner with us in planning? We're doing school very differently than the way we've done school in the past. Regardless of how we start in the fall, whether it's a hybrid, whether it's virtual, students on site, students off site, it will not be the normal school we know. So there will be some real changes. So I'm interested in forming some focus groups comprised of individuals that have specialties, areas of expertise, for example, mental health and student wellness, maybe some technology, communications. So we'll talk about those and I'll give you some more information. Look for some additional communication on how you might participate in a conversation if you're interested. So again, I always appreciate hearing the voices of our community and really appreciate when we can partner and tap into one another's skill sets and levels of expertise to really make us stronger. So look for that. And with that, I'm at questions, and I'm guessing we've got a few. I'm gonna go back just because I want this slide up on the screen as a reference, and then I'm going to answer any questions that you may have. Okay, so we got a list. Okay, so first question, I have a child in elementary, and if my child is sitting at his or her desk, will they be required to wear a mask or no, because they will be spaced 6 feet apart? So really good question. And our understanding right now from the health department is that if kids are 6 feet apart, they don't need to wear their masks. If they're not, they are expected to have a mask on. But that social distance of 6 feet also mitigates that virus being able to be transmitted from one individual to another. We're probably really going to push that with our kids though, and we recognize how challenging it will be for some of our youngest students to wear a mask. Let's face it, it's going to be challenging for all of us to wear a mask all day. However, that adds an additional level of protection to the social distancing. However, the understanding out of Montgomery County is if we're 6 feet apart, we're okay without the mask, which is why when we go to lunch in the cafeteria, students have to be 6 feet apart or more because they won't be wearing a mask. So is there a specific date that the plan needs to be sent to PDE? I thought it was 7/15. There is no specific date that our plan has to go to PDE, that health and safety plan. So we can submit that really later on this summer. And the administrative team and our board really wants to be thoughtful about the information that's in there and make sure that we've dotted our I's and crossed our T's in terms of how we would establish those health and safety parameters in our buildings. Interestingly enough, too, the county is coming out with new guidelines, new health and safety guidelines. They put a draft out today and they hope to finalize by Thursday. And honestly, a lot of the information in their document will feed nicely into our document. And it was actually developed by the Office of Public Health. And they have a level of expertise that I certainly don't have. So we'll have that as a reference, and we may add to our current draft to strengthen it based upon the information from the county health department. We also understand that PDE is coming out with new guidelines for schools supposedly this week, and we're really interested in the information that will come out of the state to guide schools in what should happen, what could happen, or how it should happen in the fall for kids. Okay, so if a family chooses to have a student engage in 100% virtual, could that be changed to the hybrid option at a later date? Yes, we certainly want to be flexible in the fall. We want to be flexible with how we offer instruction. And we know that this is a very different normal for us. And because these different instructional models aren't ones that we've had a lot of experience with, we want to work with our students and support them and certainly be flexible in how we approach things. So when will parents get a better understanding of what the virtual portion will look like? So true online instruction with a teacher and children joining in on a daily basis rather than just videos or check-ins. And I want to emphasize that, maybe in some follow-up, you can help me to know how else we could visualize that for you. And we're talking about making some videos, and maybe we'll do that in response to that particular question. I think that's a common question among members in our community. So if the question being, okay, Perkiomen Valley, if you're going to incorporate a lot more synchronous learning into virtual, what does that really look like? What does that mean for my child? So we'll see if we can't create a visual for you and help you to understand that better, so that if you have an interest in virtual learning for your child, you'll have a better sense of how they'll engage with our teachers and other students that are also in that virtual setting. We'll work on that. In a hybrid approach, will the classroom be live streamed so the kids at home can remain interactive with the in-building class and teacher? Great question, and one that we've been tossing around in a lot of different settings. There are certainly some questions about live streaming and some hesitation around live streaming, not knowing, we're not all in the same room. So there are some unknowns associated with live streaming. We're certainly looking at it. Right now, I'm not so sure we're going to go that way, but find other ways to continue to advance the curriculum for our students. And there are some very creative ways we can do that with an asynchronous model in addition to that synchronous model. So right now, not certain we're going to go with live streaming in that format. It's possible. We haven't landed on that for sure yet. So another question, if the cases drastically reduce, will the kids go back to a traditional setting, or will the plan be in place for the whole year despite the numbers? Right now, today, I would hope that we can pivot when we need to. And if that's halfway through the year, that's what I'd like to do. We want to do what's best for our students. And what I mean by that is what's healthiest, what's safest, and academically, socially, and emotionally, what's best for our students. It's really possible that we could start the year in one mode and shift to a different mode second semester. I see that as a possibility. So many uncertainties ahead of us means that I really don't know for sure, but we're going to be ready as a staff to make a shift in whatever direction we might need to. So I would say, yes, that's a possibility. How will we support special education students in a hybrid or virtual? So that's a really important question, and I'm glad that was posed tonight. There are some high-risk students that myself and Dr. Boyd and Mrs. Smith are really focused on trying to figure out how we support in a safe and healthy manner. So those students may actually come on site a little bit more often and work in smaller settings or smaller groups. Again, we'll keep the numbers down, but we know that their learning needs, their emotional needs can be very different. They're high risk in some cases, and we want to address that to the best of our ability. So there may be some adjustments and some differences in that hybrid model for different learners within our setting. So we're working to try and define that and bring some clarity to what schedules could look like for all students and for our special education ELD students as well. Okay, so I'm reading some questions. What happens with specials and special areas? Right now, we're thinking that we would offer our students all of the subjects that they would otherwise be offered in a traditional school setting. We don't have the details of the schedules worked out, but we want to continue to expose them to the learning experiences that they're used to and that we know support their growth and development. So right now, students would have experiences in all of the subjects they're used to experiencing. It's going to look different, but that's the idea. Okay. So how would we schedule siblings in a hybrid so that they can attend on the same day? So what we're thinking is we may divide students by, I'm going to shift my slide here to, we may divide students by last names. So group A may actually consist of students whose last names begin with the letter A through the letter K. And group B might be students that have last names that begin with L through Z. So we're thinking about how we divide the students so that when they're on site with their siblings. And when they're off site with their siblings in that hybrid model. Okay, so how would you accommodate a family with one child in elementary and one in middle school with a hybrid schedule if both parents are working? Yeah, we've been thinking about that a lot too. And we're trying to figure out how we might offer support to working parents, because I know that's a major concern. So just as the health and safety of your child and your children is of major concern, I recognize that the logistics of working and having your child be in this sort of schedule in school is also challenging. So we're thinking of some creative ways that we can support parents with some opportunities in our schools. We don't have them ironed out yet, but please know that we're working on that. And I'll talk more about that in some conversations very soon. But we are thinking about how we can support working parents. Okay, so if students are doing the fall virtual voyage and they have a class that has a required lab, how will this be done to actually flow with the subject matter and enhance their learning being virtual? So, yeah, it's an interesting question. There are lots of virtual labs now out there so that students can actually participate. Having been a past chemistry biology teacher, there's some really fascinating ways to engage students in science lab work digitally. And that's really different from the hands-on lab work that many of us are used to from our own school experiences. So there are some really unique and creative ways for us to be doing that. And that's what we'll take advantage of. And that's how we'll engage our students. So it will be different from what we're used to. However, we intend for it to be just as meaningful and purposeful in generating the sort of learning we're looking for. Would half-day kindergarten still be half-day in the virtual voyage? Right now, that's the plan. However, we probably need to really think very carefully about that. How do we schedule our kindergarten students in the hybrid? So we don't want to necessarily change kindergarten schedules dramatically. So they would most likely be on site for a half day, a couple days a week, and off site, a couple of days a week, that alternating schedule. So they right now aren't scheduled to be on site for a full day. It would be a half day. More to come on that. How will we handle athletics activities in a hybrid or virtual? So the athletics piece, the jury's out. We still aren't certain what's going to happen with PIAA athletics. There are some real questions about whether or not PIAA sports will actually take place this year. And I don't have any information, so please, I am not implying a yes or a no around PIAA. I do know there are conversations happening about whether or not that's the safest way to engage our students this fall. In the event there are sports and athletics in the hybrid, that does pose a challenge for families, I recognize. If kids are working off-site but have to get back to school for practice. So we have to think a little bit more about the logistics of that if the PIAA season does actually take place. And then with activities, I think we need more conversation, because I recognize that'll be a real inconvenience for families to bring students back to school if they've been home working off-site in that hybrid model. Is there a difference in curriculums between the PV virtual and the virtual voyage? Yes. I mean, learning outcomes are the same, but what I want to say is the PV virtual is a curriculum that's prepared by a third-party vendor, if you will, whereas the virtual voyage is PVSD. Same outcomes, you might follow a slightly different path to getting there. So our students are intended to be learning the same things. If I'm in biology in PV virtual, and I'm also in a virtual biology class with one of our PVSD teachers, same learning. However, it might look different in the ways that I get there. What happens if there are positive cases in school? Yeah, so we do have a self-monitoring questionnaire and an algorithm. In the event we have positive cases in our schools, and my go-to medical expert here in district, Mrs. Meg Lewis, often addresses this question for me, and I don't know if she's on the call tonight, but we do have some systems in place and policies and protocols that we've developed and articulated as part of our plan that help us to know how do we respond to something like this. And Mrs. Lewis, are you okay to speak to that a little bit and some of the health monitoring of the health of our students and staff? Would you mind doing that?
Hi, Dr. Russell. I'm sorry, it took me a while to rejoin. So we would take our direction from the Office of Public Health. And as you said, we are expecting some further guidelines from them. Hopefully this week. We did receive an email from Marisa Green and Sierra Gomez regarding that. So we do have those algorithms. We would definitely have in position that if we work in a cohort, which is what we're anticipating, then that cohort may travel together and they may be excluded together and then work from virtual at home. Part of that algorithm also includes when those kids would be allowed back in school along with staff as well.
Thank you, Mrs. Lewis. Really appreciate it. So I think one of the things that's been posed to me, and maybe we can talk it through just a little bit more, is we would not close school if somebody tests positive. Is that correct?
That is correct. We would not close school. And that is why it's important that the cohort and keeping kids together and recess together. And, you know, we've discussed if we're doing the hybrid and we're in school for those certain days, then the special area teachers may be coming into the classrooms instead of children traveling to those special area classrooms, trying to keep it as a contained group as possible. So we would be able to do that contact tracing and really monitor who was in and out of that classroom to, you know, for those mitigation purposes.
That's very helpful. So we would maintain who our students are exposed to be consistent if we could, to the degree possible. Yeah. Great. Yes. Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So a question about standardized testing and report cards. Hey, how will they be handled in a virtual hybrid? So standardized testing, and maybe by that, as a questioner, you're wondering about PSSAs or keystones, maybe you're wondering about MAP testing. And there will most likely be some amount of some of those assessments that we administer to realize where our students are as learners and how we maximize the time we have with them through our instruction. When it comes to report cards, we would like to be as traditional as possible with grading and our reporting out to you in the hybrid or the virtual model. So we're working on what does that mean and how do we measure the learning for our students in these different ways of them experiencing school. So we're trying to keep that traditional and consistent to what you know from last year. So we'll talk a little bit more about that once we finalize how we bring our students back, but that's the goal. Okay, how will recess be handled in the hybrid model, and can class be held outside if weather permits? So we certainly want our students outside as much as possible. And that's something that we've been talking about with our administrators and even in settings with our teachers. We're thinking about the purchase of little mats so that if students can go outside and participate in a lesson, they have a place to sit, picnic tables so that they can, again, have a place to sit outside and engage with the teacher. So that fresh air is really important while we're social distancing, of course. But we want to get our kids outside as much as possible. And with recess, if we're in the green, what I envision is that teachers are going to need to really coach our students and help them to realize that they need to keep a distance from one another and they can't be touching one another. And sometimes that's just a natural part of our young kids engaging with one another, but we will have to help them to know that they want to avoid that as much as possible. So we're thinking that we will be strategic with how we schedule recess. And again, as Mrs. Lewis mentioned, try and keep cohorts of students together so that they're exposed to the same students and they're almost like their second family as they participate in their classes, their learning, and then outside for recess. So we do not want to deny students recess. We are thinking about how we clean the equipment outside too. So we're really focused on cleaning, disinfecting those high touch areas. Recess equipment is an example of that. So that's a part of what's in our plan as well, keeping that equipment cleaned on a regular basis to avoid the spread of germs. Okay, so can you touch on the hybrid schedule again? Sure. So let me see if I can explain this a little better, and maybe I'll call on Mrs. Smith because you've heard my voice a lot. So I don't know, Mrs. Smith, if you would like to talk a little bit, and maybe you'll paraphrase it and help our listeners to understand that hybrid schedule and what we're thinking right now.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Russell. So in the hybrid schedule, as Dr. Russell said earlier, students would be broken into two groups. Right now, we're thinking about last name. I see some comments about possibly splitting by neighborhoods. We did think about that. Right now, we're thinking about last name, but we'll certainly consider other ideas. Your child would follow a normal schedule the day that they are in school. So whatever they would normally have on a Monday, or I know we have letter days, they would follow that normal schedule on the day that they are in school. The day that they are home from school, we are still exploring whether we would be entertaining some sort of live streaming where they would still be participating with the teacher and seeing the lesson for that day while other children were live. Or we are also considering the flipped classroom model, which is an instructional model in which teachers prepare learning in a virtual setting that students participate in independently in a schedule that works for them on that day because of your issues with childcare or where your child might be on that particular day. And that learning or what they are viewing or preparing for prepares them for the next opportunity that they're in front of their teacher. So we're exploring both of those options to see which one might work best for them. Your child would have 2 days of live lessons in the school building, and then 3 days of where they would be in another environment, that environment of your choice, depending upon your childcare issues on those other 3 days. And right now we're looking at you see like group A is a Monday, Thursday, and group B is a Tuesday, Friday. We did consider, keeping group A back to back on Monday, Tuesday, but we felt for instructional purposes that this provided the least amount of gap between the time that your child would be face-to-face with a teacher, and still provide us an opportunity to clean every evening, to clean before that next group of kids comes in, and do a more even thorough or deeper clean on that Wednesday day when no students are in school.
Thank you, Mrs. Smith. Appreciate it. So we didn't really lay out the details here, for example, in this particular proposed schedule. I'm going to go back to elementary. Yeah. Anyway, so students are on site in person Group A on a Monday, they would be in school their normal time frame, 8:40 to 3:15. And as Mrs. Smith said, they would follow that regular schedule. They would have math, they would have ELA, science or social studies, special area, lunch, recess. So we haven't drawn out those details, but they would be a part of what they would experience when they're in person or on site in school. And then the virtual learning experience from a remote location, whether it's home or somewhere else based on your childcare, would involve some activities and engagement with the teacher in ways that looks a little bit different when they're not on site. Great. Other questions? Okay. Bus services, how will this look different? Yeah, buses are a serious question right now because what we need to learn from our parents through our survey is how many of you intend to rely upon buses to bring students to school. And we want to reduce the number of students on some of our buses that are pretty crowded. Some of our buses have 3 to a seat, and that's standard on buses. They can accommodate 3 to a seat. We want to pare back on that because we want a little bit more distance between our students. They will be expected to wear masks and just 2 to a seat. So we're going to sort of work hard to decrease the number of students on buses and the crowding that sometimes is a part of buses. And we're also looking at trying to have a support person on buses so that that individual can help oversee our students, again, wearing their masks and avoiding getting too close to others on the bus while the driver can focus on driving. So buses is still something we're working on, but those are the things that we're thinking about as we plan for transportation. And again, this survey that I keep referring to for parents will help us to know, it'll give us a better idea of how we might organize our transportation. But really, ultimately, an overall goal is to keep some distance between our students, have them wear masks, and have them be supported on that bus by somebody other than the driver. Okay, so it seems as if we may have covered all the questions. Mrs. Lester, I'll call you out. Is there anything else that you are aware I should address?
I think we had some people asking, we kind of recapped the hybrid schedule, but maybe we need to also recap the virtual schedule as well, just to give people a refresher again on how that might play out.
Okay, so maybe Mrs. Smith, do you mind speaking to that a little bit? Great.
Sure. So I think really what we want to point out in here, and for those of our families that are, truly considering a virtual option, the biggest difference between what we're going to offer in what we call our fall virtual voyage and our PVV or our cyber schools is the level of synchronous time with teachers. So in the schedules that you see on the screen now, we've really tried to maintain that the days that, all of the days of the week, except for the Wednesday, is really your child is receiving live instruction via a video conference from your teacher in all of the courses that they normally would if they came to school that day. So we've tried to structure it in chunks, like the high school schedule that's on the screen right now shows you they have all of their periods from period 1 to period 10. In this draft, we've included like a 30-minute class. So we've reduced the length of the classes to provide a little bit of time in between. We all know that sitting in front of a computer screen for 6 hours a day is not good for all of us. You need to get up, you need to move, those types of things. So we've tried to chunk a class, a break, a class, a break. This still has time in it for your child to have their lunch opportunity. We are considering, you'll notice at the end of the day here, and again, this is still a draft, but we're considering some sort of check-in. Like, we are very concerned about the social emotional needs of our students as well. So trying to build into our high school schedule as well as our secondary, some sort of SEL or check-in opportunity that's not necessarily academically related, but just how are you doing? On the elementary schedule that's in front of you, you can see we call that a morning meeting. Many of our teachers already do that. And how might we be able to do that in a virtual setting and start off our mornings with that? Again, a focus on social emotional skills. The elementary schedule also proposes a synchronous time. And of course, teachers could chunk that block of time. Some of our youngest learners probably can't sit in front of a screen for 40 minutes at a time. So they could certainly chunk that. And then there's an additional block for both ELA and math that might be more small group, where we might do the guided reading or the guided math or the stations, an opportunity for one-to-one conferencing with children so that we really can ensure that each child is continuing to progress. So some time for whole group, some time for small group, some time for individual instruction. We also tried to build in, we definitely want to be able to continue our intervention, our enrichment block that your children are used to at the elementary level. So finding a time to build that in. So these schedules, I believe, really provide more face time with teachers and a schedule than what you were used to in the spring. And that's what we're hoping to provide you, that additional rigor, schedule, normalcy, if you want to say, but in a virtual environment. Where PVV, that Perkiomen Valley Virtual, is really a more asynchronous, meaning self-paced, individualized kind of program for you. Opportunities certainly to interact with your teacher, whether that's via email, via a chat, via a video conference that you set up. Some classes might periodically have a time where, hey, everybody's going to log in at the same time, but it really will be much more asynchronous than what we are going to offer. So those are kind of what I would mention as the differences between them.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Any other questions, Mrs. Lester, that we should address before we close?
I mean, there were a lot of questions, but a lot of them had themes. So I think we addressed the main themes that I was seeing in the questions. And I also would just like to remind everybody that we will record all of your responses and take a look at them. And you know, anything that wasn't addressed or that you would want to see again, we can certainly turn them into frequently asked questions section on our website and have them available for viewing at a later time.
Okay, and I'm sure we're going to connect again and probably a couple of times before the end of the month. Please look for the survey that's due to come out this week. And we really hope for a great response on that to learn more about your thinking at this point with all that there is to consider. And don't ever hesitate to reach out to me directly. I appreciate the feedback that many of you have provided and certainly answering your questions when you have them. So thank you very much for tuning in tonight. Appreciate that and have a good night. Stay well. Take care.